Today on the Everything 80s podcast, the story of Neeeeeerd's candy. Hey there, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie. Thanks for coming on out. And we're looking at a candy that I didn't realize was specifically an 80s created candy. I always thought Neeeeeerd's candy went back a lot farther, but it's an interesting story of how the idea came up, how they're actually made and produced, and how they're actually one of the most successful candies of all time. So we'll look into everything to do with that. Before we start, if you haven't already, do me a solid and subscribe to the podcast. If you haven't, anywhere you find your podcasts, I should be there. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all those good things. Okay, let's do this. So if there's the off chance you don't know what I'm talking about, we're looking at Neeeeeerd's candy, which were created by Nestle, and they came out in 1983. And they're small, irregularly shaped pieces of candy that would come in two different flavors in one box, or two different compartments in it, and there were a variety of flavors. Like I said, became one of the best-selling candies in history. So personally, when I was a kid, we had a convenience store a few blocks from my house. So, you know, like any kid with their local store, like your local variety store or whatever, it was like, you know, Willy Wonka's factory when you consider all the novelty stuff and junk and candies and whatever. And, you know, now that I look back, it was just this crappy little variety store. But, you know, at the time, it just seemed like, you know, Shangri-La as far as the candy world. So any money, allowance, anything I had like that, I would start thinking about what I would get down there. So as much as I loved all the variety in these places, I always had a few go-tos, and you probably did too, that you would spend your money on. Mine would be Big League Chew, Lick-O-Made, and Neeeeeerd's candy would be another big one. Like, it was the perfect candy. It came in this cool box. They obviously tasted good. You got the variety with the two different compartments that made up the box. And it's just interesting, as much as we've used the term nerd to take someone down a notch now, the name began to take on a different meaning, with the origins coming from Dr. Seuss. If you look back in, I forget what old book that was, when he talks about, is it Horton Hears a Who? Well, it's the first time the word nerd was used. But, you know, over time, that word became associated with the candy as much as an individual. And it's funny now, though, that nerd culture dominates society and pop culture, and it's $1 trillion industry, and has sort of changed anything that's like nerd related, you know, technology, video games, movies, that's all become part of the popular zeitgeist. So it's, you know, sort of evolved in that sense. So like I said, Neeeeeerd's was this, you know, it's a small regular shaped candy. It's similar to rock candy, but has a very thin candy coating to it. And I'll get to how it's actually made in a sec. It's basically, the ingredient wise, it's just sugar, has some dextrose, some malic acid, and then the rest of the candy is made up of less than 2% corn syrup, artificial flavors, carnauba wax, and then the artificial coloring. So that carnauba, I think that's how you pronounce it, wax, that's what gives Neeeeeerd's that glossiness, sort of shine to it, and it also gives the Neeeeeerd's that hard bite and that crunch. So actually, for how they are produced, each individual Neeeeeerd, starts out as an individual sugar crystal, which is a clear monoclinic crystal, which means they have varying shapes and features to them. They would use sugar crystals that vary from 0.2 to 1 millimeter in length, and this is what gives them all the variations in the shapes and the sizes. Each box contains two different flavors with its own compartment and opening, and they would vary from sweet to sour and all different sort of combinations. So if you remember the Neeeeeerd mascot, he was that sort of Yoshi looking like anthropomorphic creature that he seemed like part Smurf, part Pebble combined. And we look at the flavors, all the different flavors and artificial flavorings used would vary depending on the variety. So here's some of the classic Neeeeeerd's candy flavors, and you might have your own favorites. So some of the main ones: strawberry and grape, So the colors would be pink and purple, wild cherry and watermelon. So they have orange or red and green, depending on the creation of that time. There was a double dip lemonade wild cherry and apple watermelon. So that was red and yellow. They had sour lightning lemon and amped apple, which is yellow and light green. There was surf and turf. That's tropical punch and road rash raspberry. What that concoction they came out with. That was a red and blue color. Wild berry and peach, which is blue and orange. And watermelon and punch and a wild berry sort of combination. And that was green and blue. So let's look at, sort of setting the stage for this candy. And not only was the 80s a time of massive growth for, like, if you listen to the show regularly, you understand what an explosion of pop culture and cartoon shows and toys and everything that happened. But it was also a period where we got more junk food than ever before. So fast food growth was on the rise, and it brought us the creation of things like, the Happy Meal and the explosion in things like McDonald's commercials and chicken McNuggets and the McNugget buddies and associating cartoon characters with food and things like that. So basically there are all these new, facsimile foods that are vying for our attention, and all this new candy and junk food were shiny and appealing, but, ultimately empty and, pointless, like any good junk food is. So we got a few other classic candies in that time, like Pop Rocks, Mike and Ike's, Candy Buttons, but nerds were able to still carve out their own path, and they really created a beloved and very identifiable candy. So it starts in 1983 with a guy named Angelo Fraggles, who had also worked for Gardetto's Bakery, which is a snack food manufacturer, and he worked there as a sales and marketing vice president. He was involved in pasta and things like that, and he was the vice president in sales and marketing for New World Pasta. So he'd worked in different variations of food. These days he works for Dave's Killer Bread, which is a non-GMO organic whole grain bread company. So it seems obvious that the candy, again, like I just touched on, takes its name from Nerd, which was created by Dr. Seuss. It was actually the book, I was just looking up as I go here, it was that book, If I Ran a Zoo. And that's the very first mention of the word nerd, used as one of the creatures that the narrator would collect for his zoo. But it's funny how that name sort of just evolved into association with some sort of geeky individual, as there's never a direct connection that they're talking about someone like that. And the same thing with nerds, the candy, there's no indication on the packaging or promotion of them that they're referring to like a nerd geek person. But either way, the candy comes out in 1983, and they first started with the cherry orange combination and the strawberry grape. So they're a huge hit right out of the gate, and by 1985 was recognized as Candy of the Year. So here's how they actually make the Nerds. So they start out, like I said, as that sugar crystal, and they're a pure white color when they begin. So they keep coating it with thin layers of sugar over and over, like super, super thin, but that gradually thickens each piece. It's done with massive barrels that contain all the sugar crystals, and these barrels keep spinning until all the nerds have received that sufficient amount of the coats of sugar. Since they start out white, they receive their specific colors also in individual barrels. The various nerd flavors from the individual barrels are then transported to fill in the coordinating flavor on the boxes to be shipped out to our greasy little hands. The whole process to make nerds from start to finish takes 6 hours, for something that you can eat in around 12 seconds. So talking about all those different flavors, question, what is the most popular flavor of nerds? Depending what you're thinking, the answer is grape and strawberry. So there's your next dinner conversation. So here's the Nerds candy nutrition. And a serving size of Nerds candy is considered 0.5 ounces or around 1 tablespoon. Not that you'd only eat 1 tablespoon per serving, but in that serving, for all the different flavors, you will get 60 calories, 0 grams of fat, 0 grams of protein, 14 grams total carbs, 14 grams of sugar, 0 milligrams of sodium, and 0 grams of dietary fiber. Nerds has also expanded out into different products and variations. And like I said, they were started in 1983 by Nestle. They're now owned by Wonka. I always felt, I don't know, that the company name Wonka received very little fanfare for what it was named after, that it just sort of existed. Like this should have been a bigger promotional sort of crossover that I felt never happened. But here are some of the different varieties. So the biggest one probably be Nerd Ropes. Legend has it that an employee in the Nerds factory poured some gummy mixture they had over a bowl of Nerds and then went to lunch. When they came back, they found that the gummy had hardened and the Nerds had stuck to it, and voila, Nerd Ropes was born. 150 million Nerds are made just into the ropes each day. That's how much of like a side variation they have on it. Here's some of the other top versions of Nerds. You have Sour Nerds, Rainbow Nerds, Jumbo Nerds. Remember those big ones? The Nerds Gumball. I remember those. The Nerds actual gum. Then there were Dweebs, which was the soft, chewy version of Nerds. And then Neon Nerds, which were really popular. Also, we can't forget Nerds cereal. This is a real thing. Listen to my podcast all about 80s cereals if you want some more in-depth on some forgotten cereals. This came out in 1985, made by cereal company Ralston, so not one of the big players in the cereal game. But what was cool with this is they featured two different sides in the box that contained two different varieties of cereal. And there were two different varieties of the cereal. One was orange cherry, the other was strawberry grape. The boxes also contained little packages of Nerds candy inside. The cereals still contain toys and prizes in them. I don't know if that's a thing anymore. But that's the perfect breakfast cereal, that you get the actual candy with it. I never got to try this amazing dual cereal, but it does seem similar, if you know your breakfasts of the 80s, to the Nintendo cereal system. And that was also released in the 80s, and it's got that same mixture where it's a joint box where it's got two different cereals in it. So it'd be like Link and Mario and stuff like that, and two different sort of forms or flavors or whatever. Nerd cereal didn't last too long, and one of the reasons might be because of one of the side effects that happened from eating the cereal. If this happened to you, you know what I'm talking about, or if you ever remember mention of this in the 80s, it was reported that eating the specifically, which one was it? Let's see here. I'm looking back on the orange cherry combination flavor would lead to red and orange colored bowel movements and people freaking out, wondering what was wrong with them. That was chalked up to Nerd cereal. So this is just a quick look back on Nerds candy as I wrap it up here. Not a lot more needs to be said about this candy. It's one of the most famous and iconic candies of all time. I haven't had Nerds candy in like a decade or maybe more, but I can vividly remember the taste of them. You probably can too. It's got such a distinct and unique, memorable sort of flavor and sensation with the crunch, the taste and all that sort of combined together that you can instantly remember what it tastes like. Whereas other candies, you know, they might have slipped your mind and they hadn't resonated as much as this specific candy did. It's kind of the ultimate in a novelty, which is what you're looking for in a junk food. They're bright, they're colorful, they're full of sugar. They had a unique design to them. They had a very specific brand that stood out. They had different combinations. You never had to buy the same thing all the time. You could always get something different, and there was always new flavors being released, so you weren't stuck with the same old thing. Like with no offense, like Mike and Ike's was always the same product. Nerds always changed, and then they would always release those different like iterations of Nerds, whether it's the Nerd Ropes or the Jumbo Nerds or all that sort of thing. So they kept, that's probably the sign of any good food product or candy or whatever, is that they don't stay static and they keep evolving. And that's, again, what made it one of the most successful candies of all time. Okay, let's wrap it up here. Thanks for listening to the show. Hope you learned some stuff about Nerds candy. And like I said, it was one of those things I always thought, went back to maybe like the 60s or something like that. I never realized it was a direct 80s creation and still going strong to this day. So thanks for checking this out. Again, if you haven't already, subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcast. I should be there. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.